this conflict is being framed as a war, which is not a war of equals. On one side, we have a nuclear armed state, which is responding to the actions of a non-state actor. Attacks on residential complexes, 40,000 of whom have been destroyed. The most recent one being the one on Jabalia refugee complex.
It's important to, I think, point out this history of where these officials have a long track record of this type of complete disinformation, propaganda, dehumanization, in order to justify their actions, their policy decisions, and their very violent, devastating policy decisions. Even there have been many statements, even from people who were kidnapped and then released, Israelis released. People have made statements really trying to compel the state of Israel to stop the violence, that they don't want this violence to continue. Large news stations, and corporate media particularly, they're doing it from a really intentional way, whether or not they believe it or not. They're doing it to essentially defend their policies that they are defending, and it's a very common tactic to demonize protesters for protesting policies where you have an interest.
Hi everyone, thank you for tuning into New Wave. My name is Nauraiz Rana and I'll be hosting today's program. For those of you who followed us would be well aware that we've been trying to cover the Israel-Palestine conflict. We've been bringing you updates and analysis, what's happening on the humanitarian front, how things have been evolving over the course of the last 3 weeks. But today we want to take a different angle, a different lens to the conflict, and we want to contextualize all that has been happening and all that has shaped the current geopolitical scenario in the region. Joining me today, I would like to introduce and welcome Jesse Franzblau. Jesse is a senior policy advisor who works on immigration policy. He's a human rights activist and has been published in outlets such as Al Jazeera, the Huffington Post, The Intercept, and much more. Additionally, and I would like to emphasize on that part, that Jesse has done some commendable work mobilizing and organizing the Jewish Voice for Peace, and especially in one of their protests that happened at Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., where the JVP demanded immediate ceasefire. Jesse was there. He was front and center and was also one of those who got arrested. So I would like to welcome you, Jesse. Thank you for your efforts and bringing to the core the issues that I've been highlighting.
Thanks so much, Nauraiz. Appreciate it.
Almost 4,000 kids have died, which, according to Save the Children, is more than the cumulative amount of kids who have died in armed conflict globally annually over the last 3 years. So this highlights the magnitude of devastation on human life. 1.7 million people have been displaced. Scores of people have been injured. There's a humanitarian crisis that is unfolding. And these are all recorded facts and figures that are being highlighted by various agencies, even by the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, said that loud and clear. One of the main things that Benjamin Netanyahu said was that this is a fight between the children of light and the children of dark. So it gives the image that there's a religious angle to it or there's a tribal angle to it. And you yourself, you have a Jewish background, you are a Jew, but still you stand with the Palestinians or you take a more humanitarian stance. So my very first question is that, what do you make of Netanyahu's statement, the conflict that is brewing? How do you view it? And what makes you stand out for the rights which are not being seen by others who may be residing in Israel or who may not be, but have Jewish backgrounds?
I think to start with the statements of Benjamin Netanyahu, I think it's important to also look back a bit at the history of Netanyahu, who, just going back to in the post 9/11 era, played a big role in stirring up the lies about Iraq, and stirring up the militarism that the US waged in the post 9/11 so-called war on terrorism, in the sense that it's important to, I think, point out this history of where these officials have a long track record of this type of complete disinformation, propaganda, dehumanization, in order to justify their actions, their policy decisions, and their very violent, devastating policy decisions, which we're seeing now is, the UN, even UN officials, former UN officials, people who have resigned in protest, but have called this, what we're currently seeing, a genocide against people in Gaza, given that, when you look at just the definition of genocide in terms of the intent to destroy people in whole or in part, it becomes really clear and really evident the intent of officials such as Netanyahu and Netanyahu's cabinet members, who have said the most dehumanizing things about Palestinians, about Hamas, but the way that they frame it is very clear that they're talking about Palestinians as a whole, because they just from their statements, from their quotes, and it's often, it's important to also see what they are saying internally in Hebrew versus what they are saying externally in English. Often, we've seen these officials where they go on in the early morning in 8 a.m. Western time, US time, to try to make the early news, and give statements in English saying they're respecting rights of Palestinians in Gaza, that they are given a warning that the people in Gaza must leave these particular areas before they are going to be carrying out the next series of bombing. But it's quite clear why they are doing this in English and why they're doing this in this time. There's a really different way that they spin this propaganda for Western consumption, for US media, particularly Western corporate media, which consistently just repeats, the lines that come out of Israel and the lines that come from the IDF and from the Netanyahu administration, with often very little critique, little to no critique. And in doing so, they are repeating incredibly dehumanizing language that is used to basically justify violence, really systematic, planned out and orchestrated violence against Gaza that they have been carrying out for decades, as you say. The October 7th was not the beginning of a war in the way that they frame it. It was definitely a brutal attack, and did target a lot of civilians. And of course, that is important to condemn in any way when civilians are harmed. But there is completely an asymmetric power, and many even there have been many statements, even from people who were kidnapped and then released, Israelis released. People have made statements, really trying to compel the state of Israel to stop the violence, that they don't want this violence to continue in their name, that this violence is not going to weed out Hamas insurgent fighters. All it's going to do is lead to more brutality and more devastation. And so I think it's important to look at those statements that people, within Israel are saying, what writers are saying in Haaretz, the media outlet in Israel, which actually publishes far more critical stances against Israeli policy than corporate U.S. media in a lot of ways. I think it's really important to hear the voices of hundreds and hundreds of people in the U.S. who are Jewish, who are part of the Jewish faith, as I am, who grew up Jewish, who went through the whole process in the sense of in Sunday school growing up, it was completely unquestionable, the right of Israel to carry out whatever actions it was carrying out. It was always a consistent defense of Israel, and it was a consistent air of propaganda that really hovered, that convinced people, that was intended to convince people that Israel was somehow a haven, a safe haven for Jewish people in the world. And that's a really powerful propaganda point, because when that's all you grew up with, and that's the only side that you see, it becomes very difficult to start to understand the other side, particularly that the state of Israel was a colonial project and is a colonial project, and was originates out of the Balfour Declaration. The British Foreign Secretary, going back to 1917, who made the statement that they would, following the end of the Ottoman Empire, the British planned to turn over the territory to a Jewish nation in the middle of Palestine, knowing that it was a colonial project, that it was just going to follow an extension of British colonialism, and essentially, it has been an extension of U.S. and British neocolonialism, and Western foreign policy objectives in the Middle East for decades. But when you grow up with this consistent narrative that Israel is the promised land, that Israel is the home and the safe haven for Jews across the world, and then I went to Birthright. I did the Birthright trip, and they take you to all of the historic sites, of course, and explain everything from the perspective of convincing people that the land was somehow inherently owed to the Jewish populations across the world, and with stories of 4,000 years ago of how the Jews were so tied to this land, and then either completely ignore the other important historical monuments. There's no agenda in the Birthright tours to go visit the Al-Aqsa Mosque, to visit other of the most holy Christian sites either. It is very much a Jewish supremacist type of indoctrinating type of trip, but it is very hard to see beyond it. And I, in the sense of when you are kind of caught into this groupthink, and you're convinced this, it becomes very difficult to see beyond this. But I was over the years, and through involvement in other human rights type of organizing, particularly human rights organizing as it relates to U.S. policy in the Americas, I started to get a deeper sense of one, the role that Israel has played in repression in other countries, along with the U.S., or either in places such as in Latin America, when there were times when the U.S. had restrictions from Congress on funding right-wing military dictatorships that the U.S. had fomented and created, and often Israel would step in with weapons and training and intelligence, and starting to see that over the years, the devastating effect that US and Israeli policies have had in the region really started to awaken me over the years to understand that Israel is not a just place. It's not a just state, and it deserves to be criticized, as any government deserves to be criticized when they carry out mass atrocities and mass systemic human rights violations against other people. And this is the most clear and evident mass atrocity that is being carried out, that we're watching in real time. And so you see the mass mobilization of people, including, hundreds in the US, thousands of Jewish people, leaders, rabbis, standing up and saying, not in our name, is a big message. And that's been the big message of a lot of these protests and actions, saying not in our name. We don't condemn this. We don't support these type of atrocities, and they should be protested. And US funding, particularly going towards these, should be ended and should not be used to support these ongoing abuses.
That's actually a great point that you've highlighted in the end. I mean, everything that you said makes perfect sense, and it ties with the history of the region and how the settler colony of Israel came into being and what are the current state of affairs. But you mentioned that as years have evolved and you've been made more aware, you rightly stand by the fact that Israel should be criticized like any other country who are engaged in mass violations against humans, against humanitarian law, against human rights precisely. So I was just actually watching this show by James O'Brien. He's a UK anchor, and he had a guest on his show, and that guest too happened to be from Jewish faith, and that guest was. What she was trying to say is that she was criticizing the mass protests that have been happening across the UK for ceasefire and for Palestinian rights. And in that interview, James highlights the fact that it's not just people from the Muslim faith or Palestinians who are part of those protests, but a large there's a great share, not the majority share, but there's still a significant share of people who belong to the Jewish faith who are actually saying the same thing as you just did, not in my name. And the response was that those are very extreme right-winged, they are anti-Israel, and they are pushing a different narrative that they're basically vouching for the terrorists. So that was the response given to the Jews who were like you were standing for a ceasefire, for a humanitarian pause in the current crisis that is happening. If one is not a Jew, and you would have come across that very frequently as well, that one of the biggest pressure points is that whenever one is propagating for the rights of Palestinians or criticizing Israel, it's conflated with being anti-Semitic, and which leads to a lot of advocates being wary of how and what should they say, how should they frame their words. So if you are to speak with that person who was on that guest, how would you address her, or people with that mentality? Because having an ally, someone who comes from a Jewish faith, but is for some reason has been made more cognizant and aware, how would you direct it to them to develop that same sense of understanding? Or what are the pain points that you would like them to highlight on to make a more rational, logical deduction?
Yeah, I think particularly for, people making that argument on, large news stations, and corporate media particularly, they're doing it from a really intentional way. Whether or not they believe it or not, they're doing it to essentially defend their policies that they are defending, and it's a very common tactic to demonize protesters for protesting policies where you have an interest in. So you often see, for example, groups like the Anti-Defamation League, which often are going after and attacking Jewish people and communities of color for protesting Israel. And they use this completely conflated notion and completely harmful narrative that criticizing Israel is anti-Semitic. It's been something that's been developed and shaped over the years to silence dissent and to silence any criticism of the state, which happens in any of the most repressive tactics, right? I mean, looking in history, the South African apartheid state completely demonized people who were protesting across the world. I mean, the U.S. had Nelson Mandela on a terrorist list until the mid-90s, late 90s, calling him a terrorist for resisting the apartheid state, and then calling anyone who criticized apartheid or sympathized with the people resisting that system or supported people resisting that system, the rights of people who were being completely living under an apartheid state, calling them terrorist sympathizers and demonizing them. And so it's a very common tactic, and so it's hard to take serious at all these type of allegations, given that they are just such a broken trope, but they are very extremely harmful, and they very much lead to more violence against people who are Jewish, and they lead to more violence against they lead to more Islamophobia and anti-Arab violence and sentiments, because they're the one associating the state of Israel with Jewishness, which is a false conflation. And in doing that, they are the ones fomenting anti-Semitism. So it is very anti-Semitic to say that criticizing Israel, criticizing a very human rights abusing government of its abuses is anti-Semitic. It's a very harmful narrative, but it's very strategic. It's used in order to discredit, in order to take out the wind behind large movements, and we can just see it happen again and again. And so it's very similar to the Black Lives Matter protest movement, how people, particularly early on, when this was happening really early on in 2014, 2015, when the Black Lives Matter movement was really starting, and the way that anyone associated with these type of protests were being criticized and called anti-police, and this is where the all lives matter type of narrative develops, and it's very similar here to the way that protesters are demonized. And it's incredibly tragic to see that people are silenced in this way. I mean, it's also important to put it in the context of people who are Israelis who are speaking out. I mean, look at the organization Breaking the Silence. It's literally called Breaking the Silence because they are silenced in a way where speaking out is so dangerous, because you're ostracized, you're demonized, you bear the brunt of the repression from the Israeli state, and so I think it's really important to put it in a context, but also to understand when these people are levying these criticisms. I mean, for example, it was a Fox News anchor who asked the U.S. State Department official the other day, I believe yesterday, they asked them about anti-Israel protests, completely trying to just stoke them and to rile them up. And then the response from the State Department spokesperson was absolutely absurd, and they started getting into how the work that the administration is doing against anti-Semitism. So they were the ones that made the association from anti-Israel protests to anti-Semitism, which is completely bogus. It's a very harmful, tragic narrative that's pushed by Fox News alike, as well as MSNBC alike. You see how there's no air between these major corporate outlets that are either on the right or liberal or whatever they consider themselves. They are using the same really harmful propaganda.
And it's also important to highlight like how you mentioned the word and how they've been framing it as anti-Israel. Sometimes it's not even anti-Israel. It's like pro-Palestine, it's pro-liberation, it's pro-human rights. But then that is where the framing, the narrative peddling comes in very handy. And these key words try to build the entire image and create these nuances, which are not that complicated to begin with. So anyhow, like my last question for you would be that, of course, you belong to the Jewish faith, but you also happen to be an American citizen. And the role that the US has been playing, especially this recent Joe Biden's administration, in which they're advocating for, and Joe Biden himself is requesting for a $105 billion military aid package for Israel to help them for their self-defense engagements, is quite shocking. It's disheartening. There's so much more that could have been done, but it also kind of highlights how the structural roots themselves are completely, how to put it, ignorant and refuse to acknowledge the atrocities that are committed against, unarmed civilians. How, and the Jewish Voice for Peace, actually one of their mandates is addressing this bill, and they've been very vocal about it, and so have you. So how do you feel about US's role, the way it's shaping its policy for Israel? And do you think that the pressure that is being applied by organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace and other Arab organizations that are pro-Palestine, would that kind of help them recalibrate that policy? Do you envision a positive impact coming out of it?
I think there is going to get a point where there is going to be a tipping point where the US, because of so much opposition, Washington is not going to be continuing to be able to essentially finance the occupation. I mean, the US has paid for around 20% of Israel's military budget over the years. They give around $4 billion in aid, which is largely military weaponry. It's US-made bombs often, and US-made armament that's carrying out, the direct attacks on the people of Gaza. So the number one priority in terms of ending this conflict is preventing US funds, preventing any more US funds. And this large supplemental request that the White House is asking for, a lot of it is funds for Ukraine. It's some funds for Taiwan, it's funds for Israel, and it's also funds for border enforcement. And it really illustrates where Washington's policies are in terms of fueling war in a lot of ways. But the Israel funding, I think, is around 14 billion. And it's largely military weaponry, and it's largely going to weapons contractors who are literally making a killing off of this. When you just look at the stocks of Lockheed Martin and other stocks that are skyrocketing when war happens, and whenever the U.S. asks for billions and more for new type of weapons and weaponry. So that's a number one ask, and definitely invite people to go to Jewish Voices for Peace, which is an organization that I support. I'm not part of the structure, but I definitely just support in the organizing efforts, and urge people to go there and to go to other sites to look at avenues to notify your member of Congress, particularly in the US if you have a member of Congress, which if we live in DC we don't, but other folks that are able to, and lobby and tell your member of Congress to not support this funding, more weapons to Israel, and to also call for a ceasefire, which is a really baseline ask, but there's only been actually a handful of members in the House of Representatives who called for ceasefire, very brave members of Congress. And as of today, there's one senator who has explicitly called for a ceasefire, Senator Durbin, who is a very powerful senator. So that should hopefully snowball. So more members are asking for that. Really, it's quite a no-brainer ask to just ask for ceasefire in order to facilitate peace.
Absolutely. I think it is it's very imperative at the moment, given how the crisis has unfolded and the amount of casualties that have happened, and not just casualties, the people who remain living, breathing, they are going through an entire different humanitarian ordeal that is even very hard to imagine. Having been displaced, having lost family members, not having enough food to eat, having no access to food, water. I mean, there are reports that they've been forced to drink seawater, which is unconsumable, things like that. But I mean, kudos to you and kudos to all others who are making the effort, who are trying to pressurize their respective governments and making the right set of policies and taking the right steps, which is the need of the day. And they just appeal to basic human empathy. It's humanity at the end of the day. So on that note, thank you so much, Jesse. It was great having you. It was a very insightful discussion, and all the best for your ventures.
Appreciate you. Thanks for reporting on this, Nauraiz.
Thank you.